Okay, thank you everyone for being here. We're absolutely delighted to have Kathy Hinde here with us to give a talk. And Kathy is a fabulous composer, sound sculptor, sound artist, maker of things physical and digital, somewhere in the realm between sound art installations and instruments. And I will turn it over to Kathy to tell us about some of her recent work.
Thanks very much. Great, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. So I've titled my talk Magnetic Sensing because I'm in the middle of creating a new piece that is around magnetic sensing. And so for the talk, I'm going to start off by showing you a few previous pieces of work. And I've tried to sort of tease out some threads that make sense of what I'm currently doing with magnetic sensing, I hope. So my practice is quite broad. So for this first slide, I've tried to sort of pull together some of the things that I think are emerging from my practice and what I'm going to share with you to do with indeterminacy, open scores, generative systems, and then some that are kind of leaning more towards our relationship with the more than human world. And the two sort of sentences on the right, connecting with the more than human and embodied knowledge or kind of durational experiences, are kind of some of the ways that the work that I create plays out. So I'm going to start with a piece that I made 12 years ago in 2014 called Tipping Point. And the reason I wanted to start with this, I think it was became a bit of a new direction in my practice. And so my background is in composing music and in fine art, visual art installations. And so I'm always trying to sort of bring together things that are quite visual with my sonic work. So this sound sculpture I titled Tipping Point, and it came about because I wanted to draw attention to our relationship with water, and it was at a time when there was a lot of flooding on the Somerset levels. I live in Bristol. And I wanted to create a piece of meditative sound work that focused purely on shifting water levels, changes in water levels. And I called it Tipping Point as a kind of conscious decision to try and draw awareness to climate tipping points and things at the time. So I'll just start by describing the installation. So it's a series of glass vessels. I worked with a scientific glass blower at Bristol University physics department. And so I constructed a stand that held two glass vessels that are connected by a silicon tube and a mechanical arm at the top so that I could move the arm from left to right. And because the two glass vessels are connected, the body of water that they're sharing will become full in one and empty in the other. So it has this relationship, sharing this body of water. And there's 6 pairs in the piece. And the way that it makes sound is there's a microphone inside at the top of each glass vessel and a speaker external to it, and it's just creating audio feedback. So I'm working with a max patch that is listening to the sound inside the glass vessel, and then it's adjusting the microphone gain to create a balancing point of audio feedback. And then the level of the water tunes the feedback to the resonant frequency of the space remaining in the glass vessel. So same principle of how an organ pipe works, in that I'm tuning it by changing the water level. And I was kind of really interested in using feedback as a way to create sound because I wasn't actively making the sound. I was kind of creating the conditions from which sound could emerge. And I kind of liked thinking about it in that sort of way. Also inside each glass vessel there's a light, and that is audio responsive. So sometimes with the feedback you'd get kind of like pulsing beat interferences, and then the light would kind of accentuate that. But also from playing with it and experimenting with it, I realised there's a very different kind of sound world when all of the glass vessels were resonating. It became this kind of really intermingled texture of sound, and you couldn't really tell what direction things were coming from. Which was very different to when you had 1 or 2 vessels making their chiming sounds. It became a much clearer sound. So I also wanted to kind of create a generative system so that I could change how many tubes were resonating, but that it wasn't a fixed sequence and it would have some level of indeterminacy. So I'd made a really, really simple system for how many glass vessels are active, what percentage of them are active, like might be from 1 to 12, but not saying which ones, and then giving it a kind of probability of whether the motor would be on or off. So is it a fixed tone or a sliding tone? And that was it. So I just made those parameters and set them off into a kind of a random sequence. So it would go through all these different configurations in any order. But what I really wanted to happen was for it to be continually changing and for people to experience different densities of sound, but not to make a fixed sequence. And it was, and again, I kind of enjoyed that way of creating a system that then I could sort of sit within and be surprised by the new kind of configurations of things that happened that I might not have necessarily decided on myself. So again, that's a way that I like to work with these things. So I'm going to just play a short video of the installation. So that's a really short video of the installation, and it just kind of like continued, and it kind of created quite a meditative space for people to walk into because it was actually very dimly lit, and I'd find people were spending quite long periods of time kind of lying on the floor, and so that was that was the kind of responses. And also just people kind of interpreting it in all kinds of different ways. Like I had this idea about water levels changing and our relationship with water, or kind of like extremes of droughts and flooding, and this kind of just focusing on this water level. Some people thought they were kind of like lungs and they were to do with breath, and they were like bodies. And so I was really interested in all these other kind of different perspectives. So I liked the way it had this ambiguity. But also as I was working with this piece and made this system and observed it, I decided that I could also treat this installation like a kind of distributed instrument in a room. So I started to perform live with it. And then, again, that was another shifting point in my practice where I started to think about this installation as a possibility that it could be an instrument. So I started to perform live with it. And the way that I could perform live with it, I could move the motors and I could make the microphones live or not live. And that was really all I was controlling with the installation. But then I also did take some of the output of the feedback sounds and added some just very minimal effects, like some like reverb and pitch shifting and a bit of distortion, and put that into the room as well. And I was finding that quite interesting because the acoustics of the room would also have this kind of effect on how the feedback was happening inside the vessels. And then another interesting thing about performing with it was that I couldn't really necessarily understand what might happen when I made a shift. So I'd make a shift, the water would flow very slowly from one to the other, and then the feedback tone would kind of emerge. But because of also feeding back the sound into the room, it might be in a different harmonic. So I kind of got quite interested in trying to create an instrument that I could have a dialogue with or a conversation with that I couldn't like fully control, so to speak. So I'll play you a short extract from a performance. that's just a short extract from a performance where I was kind of in that little section was kind of coaxing a situation where I kind of gradually moved them all into their kind of lowest position of water. So yeah, and more recently, I decided to revisit this piece because I got invited to create a piece of music for the Quiet Music Ensemble in Cork, and I was interested to kind of build them a system that was similar to Tipping Point, but that would also interact with live acoustic instruments. And so I ended up building something kind of similar-ish, but without... Oh, yeah, I forgot to kind of say, so the max patch that I used in Tipping Point, it couldn't ever let the feedback spiral completely out of control. It was always sort of like adjusting the gain just so that it balanced on the feedback point. So for this system, I made a manual mechanical arm that didn't use motors, that you moved by your hands, and again, balancing water, using feedback, but I made a control system that simply was using audio feedback and a pitch shifter and a tremolo. So the balancing of the feedback was had to be done much more kind of manually, and so the players had to really kind of balance the feedback, also using, and an EQ, using these few effects. But what was kind of interesting about this, and what I made two systems, so there were 4 vessels. Sometimes when somebody might play a tone on an acoustic instrument in the room, that would then sort of set off one of the feedback vessels. So there was this really nice, delicate kind of balancing ecosystem in the space that the players played with very delicately. And with, there was like tons of listening and kind of balancing and interacting with each other and the glass vessels. And I started off with all these kind of like open scores and like written instructions and text-based scores, and I ended up being they're really amazing improvisers, purely an improvisation with the title Acts of Balancing and Unbalancing, and that was kind of enough. And the way that they played with it and the way that it behaved kind of shaped the piece, and even though it's different every time, there's a definite flavour of what this piece ends up sounding like. So I'll just play you a tiny bit of that. So again, it ended up being one of these kind of quite like long tone, durational pieces with lots of kind of like quietness and slow shifting between tones. So I'm just going to put a slide about Pauline Oliveros because I'm a massive fan, and I've been really interested in her deep listening and sonic meditations practice. And as I was working on Tipping Point, I also wanted to start bringing on people on listening walks to listen to rivers and streams and in cities. So I'm going to speed up a bit because I've probably got too many slides. So I've got a real fascination with listening underwater and sort of trying to find hidden sounds of a location. And I find that I don't necessarily use field recording in my finished work, but it's very, very much part of my process. And also this idea of sort of like discovering more about a place or a location or a phenomena through listening to sounds you can't usually hear. So I love using hydrophones. And so with Tipping Point, I started doing these listening walks when I was showing that piece. And then this is a bit later on. I did a residency in the north of Scotland in a place called the Flow Country, which is one of Europe's largest blanket bogs. And water's like really, really crucial for this ecosystem. So it's a peat bog, and the way that the moss decomposes to form peat, the reason it forms peat is because it's really, really saturated in water. And peatlands are sort of now being recognised as being, one of the world's best ways of locking carbon. So the Flow Country stores over 400 million tonnes of carbon, which is more than twice the amount of carbon stored in all of Britain's woodlands combined. So it's a really, really crucial, important ecosystem and environment, and holds a lot of biodiversity. So when I was there, I wanted to invite people on these listening walks, but I was kind of like really into Polynovaris at the time, and I wanted to call them deep listening walks. But for other reasons, because I'm also really interested in ways of inviting people to consider like timeframes or scales that are beyond our usual sort of human frame of reference. So to think about deep time and think about long periods of time. So peat, 1 millimetre of peat forms in a year. So this 10-metre deep peat has taken 10,000 years to form. So I kind of also wanted to invite people to sort of listen together underwater into the peat, but also to consider about the time and the carbon that's kind of held there, and to just contemplate the fact that we could be, listening back in time, and just to kind of like imagine and be imagining on different time frames and scales. And I'm also really interested in Timothy Morton, and I thought this kind of related I was really interested in his concept of the hyper-object, which he talks about in a term of a hyper-object being something that is on an unthinkable timescale or scale that is beyond our human frame of reference. And he uses this to talk about objects like, styrofoam or plutonium, or things that we can't really fully contemplate the time frames that these things exist upon. And also, this kind of like leads into a fascination with these hidden sounds, but also very, very low-pitched sounds, infrasound, and thinking about waveforms and sound and these sort of experiential nature of sound, the physicality of sound, and how sound relates to weather and these kind of bigger kind of planetary systems. And I started looking quite a lot at seismology. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a piece that is inspired by those kinds of ways of thinking about sound waves moving through the planet as seismic waves. And I created a piece called Earthquake Mass Reimagined, which probably could have a better title, to be honest. But anyway, I discovered this 15th century mass by a Franco-Flemish composer called Antoine Brumel. And it was called the Earthquake Mass because it's composed around a piece of liturgy that talks about the earth moving. I was interested in this piece because the final movement was discovered rotting away into the ground, so it's incomplete. So I just kind of got this idea about using this incomplete movement of the earthquake mass and somehow working with seismic data. And I was also really interested in working with vinyl because I like the way that vinyl is a sort of physical imprint of a sound into a surface, a bit like a sort of how a seismic wave moves through the earth. And also at the time, I was working with an organisation in Scotland called Cryptic, and they wanted to connect me with an organisation in Mexico, Anglo Arts. And so, because Mexico's on a lot of tectonic plates, there's a lot of seismological research happening there, but also there's like a lot of history of earthquakes and risk of earthquake happening in Mexico, all the time. So it's a kind of very different sort of situation to be living with that kind of risk. So I actually went to Mexico, had lots of chats with seismologists and talked to a lot of people about their experiences of being there with this risk of earthquake and also human experiences of earthquakes that have happened. And I collaborated with a choir called Staccato. Part of this project had to happen in lockdown, so I actually made the recordings of the choir. An amazing audio engineer called Paco Avillera made the audio recordings of the choir. And what I was interested in working with the choir on is to try and sort of make recordings of all the fragments of this final movement with their individual voices, to then somehow combine with seismic data and these vinyl recordings. So that's kind of where I was at with this piece. I did eventually get to go to Mexico to continue with the project and have a more sort of like in-person experience of the interactions with the seismologists. And I wanted to kind of try and connect with some of the recent histories in Mexico, and these monasteries that I went to visit are still in restoration from the 2017 earthquake that happened near Mexico City. And I wanted to kind of like try and combine some elements of these vocal sounds, this singing of this incomplete movement, with the resonant space of these empty monasteries. And so I carried out the kind of Alvin Lucia, I'm sitting in a room technique, where I played the sounds of the voices into the space, recorded that, and then played that back and recorded it again to kind of try and create a recording of a sonic description of the space that had the origin with the singers. So I think I have a recording. Yeah. So this is the original recording. And then this is after maybe only 4 or 5 iterations. So I kind of generated this material that was very relevant to those specific locations. And in some other parts of Mexico City, I played the sounds of the voices with transducers through the ground and then listened to it with a contact mic. So I could kind of, I guess, just think of the voice as a seismic wave moving through that particular part of the ground. And I kind of gathered this material that had the origin in the singers' voices, but then became really kind of affected by these locations and the materials and materiality of these buildings and spaces within Mexico City. So I pressed all of the individual voices onto separate vinyl records. Again, was really interested in how that kind of has a parallel to the seismic wave or fault line. And the final piece is a kind of configuration of these 12 adapted turntables. And I showed in quite a few different kind of non-art spaces. This is in an old pipe factory in Glasgow. It also was shown in lots of different places in Mexico, and more recently at Bristol New Music in a 15th century crypt that was built at a similar time to when Brumell composed the music. So I think this is the video. Yeah. So the way that I kind of used the seismic data that was actually from I decided that I'd use the data from the 2017 earthquake, because that's how I ended up relating the sounds to these different specific locations in Mexico. I created an adaptation of the record player where I could lift the needle up and down. And it's kind of like, I was interested in sort of fragmenting the voices and then putting them back together, and using the seismic data to configure that. And so it's almost like a sort of physical granulation of the sound, so I could sort of fragment the voices by literally lifting the needle and dropping it again. And I also built a system so I could fade in and out the sound from each record player. So each record player's got a built-in speaker, and I'm adjusting the sound with this kind of needle stylus up and down. And then in the rest of the room, I've got 4 other speakers and a sub where I've kind of made a composed piece that is using those sounds from the monasteries, the resonant sounds and the sounds from recording through the ground. And then I've sort of set sort of different levels of seismicity for how I use the data. So as it gets more agitated, each record player's kind of got its own levels of behaviour. So it will go from being very agitated, where I just sort of set on and off times for the stylus to go up and down, but it's got it's not. I give it kind of probabilities of how long it might be on and off for, so I don't get anything. I wanted it to definitely not kind of create a regularity. I wanted it to feel sort of quite cloud-like and fragmented. And to how many record players are active. And I guess similar, very simple sort of techniques that I used in Tipping Point to try and create something that would have levels of activity and density but not repeat or be a fixed score. So I'll play you a little extract of that. So that's a little extract from Earthquake Mass, and now I'm going to talk about the project I'm doing at the moment. So that was just sort of a few pieces to sort of hopefully put in context a bit more about my general practice and what I'm investigating, the kind of work that I make. So this actually started a couple of years ago, and I did a residency at the Instrument Inventors initiative in The Hague in the Netherlands, which is a really great place. It's an artist-run community. Anyway, for a long time I've been really interested in magnetic sensing, and especially birds' magnetic sense, and that they can sense the geomagnetism of the planet, and they use that to navigate. They've kind of got a magnetic compass, and that's how they migrate and fly these long distances. And this magnetic sense is still not really known by scientists who are kind of researching this, but the current supported theory is that a bird's magnetic compass relies on light-activated proteins called cryptochromes found in the retinas of their eyes. And these cryptochromes act as photoreceptors that, when they're excited by blue or UV light, they create radical pairs that allow the bird to sense the magnetic field of the planet. Because actually the geomagnetic field is very weak, and that's why scientists don't really know how birds can sense it. So I just got really fascinated, again, by this scale of something like the geomagnetism of the planet and quantum particles in birds' eyes that's how they're sensing this sort of planetary phenomena. And it made me sort of think about Timothy Morton's hyperobjects again, and all these kinds of like things to do with waveforms of minuscule sizes and large sizes. So I started looking into more aspects of the Earth's geomagnetic field, the magnetosphere. And I have a radio that picks up natural radio, which means it's possible to pick up sort of sonic activity from the magnetosphere. So what I'm about to sort of go through are just like lots of different like lines of inquiry and experiments that I did on my residency in The Hague. So this, should play, yeah, there we go. So that's just a recording from the VLF radio at that point on the harbour of The Hague. So often when you're using that pickup, you need to be away from sort of main power sources because it's very sensitive. And I also started to like read up on atmospheric electricity and sort of the history of our knowledge and relationship with how storms happen and how that gave birth to kind of the origin of using electricity and storing power from static electricity. So, during storms, massive amounts of charged electrons discharged through lightning. And as our climate is changing and warming, the atmosphere holds more moisture and energy, which will increase the amount of electrical storms. I started to look in the history of people like making experiments with these phenomena, and I came across the Franklin bells, which you might already know about. But essentially, it's when there's an imbalance of charge between two bells, and then this metal bell will oscillate and ring the bell. And Franklin created, kind of used this phenomena as a kind of early storm warning. So having a lightning rod in a house that connects to one bell and the other bell connected to Earth, as the kind of like atmospheric energy in the storm clouds became highly charged, it would create this imbalance in charge, and then the bell would start ringing. And then this kind of started people thinking about, electric charge in the atmosphere. I then discovered this instrument that was invented at a similar sort of time that uses magnets and bells to create sound. So it was just someone very fascinated with sort of invisible magnetic fields being used to kind of make movement and ring bells. And Bertolin, the inventor of this, was actually a natural scientist, and he was very fascinated with there was a lot of experimentation with magnetism and electricity at the time. And this instrument was kind of taken as a curiosity, but Bertolin was passionate about what we might now refer to as transdisciplinary research. And he said, it's not just the degree of usefulness provided by the magnetic harpsichord, there are others that immediately arise. Everything that is capable of producing movement in the universe and can affect different bodies either immediately or delayed, and move without visible touch if necessary, unquestionably cannot be ignored. So he was kind of just like wanting to sort of create these, make a case for experimenting with this phenomena to create instruments and those kinds of fascinations. Going way back to 600 BC, there was the first report of the phenomena of static electricity being produced by rubbing amber and wool. And the word electricity does actually come from the word amber, because Greek for amber is electron. So this kind of static electricity remained, again, like a curiosity for like just over 2,000 years. And it wasn't really until the sort of 17th century that people started to search for methods to kind of harness this power and also make the connection between this static electricity effect and lightning. So Franklin was kind of, quite early on thinking about how these things are related, and this static electricity could be harnessed in different ways. And then as you move through, when I was on my residency in The Hague, I just happened to be close to Haarlem, which is where the world's largest electrostatic generator is housed in the museum there, in the Taylor's Museum. So this uses really large glass discs to create static electricity, friction generator, and then that power is stored in these Leyden jars, which is kind of like a giant battery of capacitors. So that was the largest that had ever been built. So there's this way of kind of harnessing the static charge. Very, very, very high voltage, so it's low current, high voltage. Like this is like 330,000 volts this makes. Then, as sort of time went on, this is a later invention, the Wimshurst machine, which uses electrostatic induction rather than just friction. So I'll just play a quick video of that. So these were sort of things that were in the museum. One of my introduction to the workshop was me trying to make one of those, which wasn't very successful. I used 2 old CDs from a charity shop. But just started fiddling around with ideas that were to do with electrostatic energy, atmospheric electricity, magnetism. I made a crystal radio, which is a very early radio that uses a germanium crystal to act as a diode, and it is unpowered. It uses the actual power of the radio wave as energy. So it picks up a very, very weak signal. So I experimented a little bit with that, and I picked up lots of really interesting noises in the atmosphere. Again, just trying to sort of tap into how might I listen to or kind of connect with atmospheric electricity on different scales. I was looking to chat to a scientist that was working with magnetic sensing or similar things, and I made contact with this lovely guy called Sam England, who's based at Bristol University, where I live, but it turns out that he's moved to Berlin, but we had a chat anyway. And he was actually researching something slightly different to magnetic sensing called electroreception. And he had been researching bees and how they use electrostatic sensing. And bees are one of the most sort of static species, as you can see from that chart. And so they actually do communicate with flowers through electrostatic charges. So they can tell if another bee has visited that flower due to the sort of the electrostatic energy and things like that. So this, again, was really fascinating in the sense of, like, you know, how birds are sensing the magnetic field and other species are. Bees are kind of moving through space completely, you know, really perceiving the electrostatic charge in the atmosphere. And Sam told me that when they perform the waggle dance, they do it in the hive, which is in darkness. And so part of the communication with that waggle dance, which is kind of communicating where, you know, where flowers are to other bees, it's not just sound, they're actually moving static charge around, and that's kind of how they're communicating and exchanging information with each other. So they're really charged. And Sam said that they are using a multimodal transfer of knowledge from bee to bee, which I kind of really liked as a sentence. So yeah, just going back to the Taylor's Museum, I was also kind of interested in these very early batteries that use layers of zinc and copper, and also this one on the right uses seawater. So I did actually go to the coast to see if I could kind of create a battery generate some kind of charge from seawater. This might be a video.
Batteries from mud. So I thought I'd go to Zandvoort with my jars and some copper and aluminium and crocodile clips to see if I could generate any kind of voltage from seawater. So that was really fun, and I did actually manage to get over 1 volt from 4 cups of seawater that joined together. And then while I was there, the big aerial that's the weather station, I connected my crystal radio to that. And I picked up lots of different noises. It was kind of exciting to connect to existing aerial, and it got me thinking about different sort of structures that already exist that could be used to tap into different atmospheric radio signals or other signals that are in the atmosphere, which also kind of made me think about this kind of magnetic sense.
Yeah, so that was just like a little extract from a short video that summarised my residency, but I wanted to show you the seawater part. Again, magnetic rocks, started looking at lots of different magnetic rocks and thinking about how I might work with those, electromagnetic coils. Also, coincidentally, the Hague has got the best radio spares shop that I've ever encountered in my life, called Radio 20, and it had so many different coils, radio parts. Having sort of before my residency searched out all these different things like ferrite rods and things that I could like use to sort of make radios or receivers or transmitters with, they were all in this shop. So I'd really recommend a trip to the Hague to this shop. It's absolutely fantastic. So started looking more and more at coils and how they use as pickups and as drivers, and you know, just experimenting with a kind of open version of an EBO, using a pickup and a driver and a little amp to drive a string, using a feedback circuit, which is the same principle as an electronic bow. But again, I was just kind of like experimenting with magnetism, ways of charging things, moving things without touching them. This is a really, I don't have the original footage, it's a very short extract of that.
One of the things I discovered.
So that, yeah, really short. So it was just to kind of share all the different kinds of experiments and things I was playing with. I then managed to find a magnetic pendulum toy in a flea market, like a whole bag of magnetic toys. And this one was just using a free-moving pendulum over magnets that were, you could flip the polarity. And I sort of thought, I really want to explore how I could use something like this to create an instrument or an installation or something. So I started messing around with, you know, just magnets with like reverse polarity on the deck, just because I kind of like thought this is quite an interesting motion, and I really liked the way that it moved. It kind of reminded me a little bit of the bees waggle dance or something like that, and I loved the way that it had this slightly chaotic-y type of movement, which is something I'd find really appealing, as I was kind of saying with tripping point, so to try and set something off but not being in full control of it. So I started to embrace this as a way of creating a prototype. So this is kind of the setup that I started to put together for the end of my 1 month residency. And I was thinking to myself, well, I really like the movement. How might I use that to make sound? I was actually coming into like the last week of my residency when I was at this point, and I was like, how should I make that sound? So I decided to put LEDs on the end, because I actually started thinking again about the cryptochromes in the bird's eyes and that relating to light. So I've put a magnet in the end of each pendulum and an LED, and then I've created different arrays of magnets. This is the repelling magnet one. But the other two, I decided to sort of use electromagnetic coils and created a little controller where I could change the strength of them and flip the polarity of those coils. So it meant that I could set something in motion just purely by switching magnetic fields and sort of start things moving and start these lights moving around without touching them. And then I was thinking about multiple ways that I could use that to create sound. So I started using light sensors, light-dependent resistors, which you can see that I've put into this circle here. And there's different arrays of light sensors in the other two. And I tried two processes of ways of making sound. And the first one is a really simple circuit that I already had kind of messed around and made from the Nicholas Collins handmade electronic music book, which is just a NAND gate, logic gate synth where the light sensor is part of the circuit. It's one of the resistors in the circuit. So it essentially changes the frequency of a square wave. So it makes it faster or slow depending on how much light is landing on it. So I thought, well, that's really immediate. And the light sensor is part of the thing. It's a very simple circuit. It's something that I know that I can make. So I did two iterations of it, one with a single light sensor and one with 3 light sensors as a kind of cascading set of oscillators. And I plugged 2 of the pendulums into those. So I've got these 2 pendulums. This one has got 3 light sensors, and that one's just got 1 in the middle. And then I'm switching the coil, so it means that I can either attract the pendulum to the center or ping it away. And that's all I can do for moving it. But it became quite fun because if you leave it on a kind of repelling setting, it will kind of bounce back at a different angle. Or you can wait for it to just go past the center and then give it a kick so that it speeds up. So with this one, I was trying I could kind of set the pendulum in motion, and then it would like randomly go over these different light sensors and change the sound. Whereas this one, because the light sensor is also in the middle, it meant that I could pull it to the sensor and it would create the sort of most kind of frenetic sound, or I could ping it away and it'd be quieter. So it kind of became quite a raw, unsophisticated way of kind of starting off making sound. And then on this pendulum, where I've got 5 light sensors and 5 repelling magnets, the one that I showed you on the desk, where you get this kind of interesting, more complex movement because I've got more magnets, I put the light sensors into an Arduino so I could send them into my computer, and then I used those to just control a really basic kind of like soft synthesizer where I was changing the pitch and the volume of the synth depending on how much light was falling. So I've got these kind of 3 different versions of ways of moving a pendulum by flipping magnetic coils, and then sensing how the light was moving on the end of the pendulum to make sound. So here's a really short video of some of those experiments.
And I started playing around with pendulums with magnets on the end, and then setting other magnets onto the table, and just watching how they attracted and repelled created this really interesting dance-like movement.
So again, I've just got this edited video of my documentation. So that's a little bit of an insight into sort of what I kind of made on that residency and where I got to. And so since then, actually following that residency, I did another really big project for 18 months. So I kind of had a break from it, and I've just come back to look at these pendulums and decide where I might go with that idea. And I sort of now I've got it at a point where I actually decided that I'm having all of my light sensors coming into my computer, and I've sort of made I've worked with someone, Matthew Olden, who I collaborate with, on a maps patch that takes that information in, and I can kind of obviously just map it in like whatever ways that I want to do that. So I got invited to Cafe Otto to do an 8-channel performance in January this year, and I thought actually I'm quite interested in looking at how I use that swing of the pendulums to spatialise the sound in a multi-channel performance. So this performance, I was kind of focusing quite a lot on the spatialisation, and I used a lot of samples that were drawn from electromagnetic recordings, the natural radio recordings, weather recordings, Aeolian harp recordings, things that I felt kind of made sense in a sound world. And it meant that I could make a sort of 30-minute spatialised sound performance using the pendulums. And I was also using some of the information as converted that to control voltage to go into my modular synth to also kind of explore that possibility. And then last month I got invited to go to the Beast Dome, and that meant that I had the chance to work with a 22-channel sound system. So again, I adapted that system so that I could work with the pendulums and use the way that they swing to spatialise the sound on that plane, but then also I was kind of moving it up and down. And in both of those performances, I also had other kind of textural sound material that I was bringing in to create the composition. I can play you, this isn't edited, but I can hop through bits of this video. I think. The main thing about that performance was its ultra spatialization, which is not really coming across that well. But again, yeah, just sort of like interested in how I perform with this instrument. So I've flickering the lights a little bit. And my main way of interacting with it is really just flipping the electromagnetic coils in the center. Whoops. Yeah, I'm sort of still, as I say, I'm still experimenting with this piece and different ways that I can work with it. And I'm actually looking to sort of also create an installation version of this where I have multiple pendulums in the room. And I'm interested in sort of creating behaviours that might relate to each other, but I'll probably completely simplify the sound again and may look again at creating a synth-based way of making sound that directly uses light sensor information. But I'm also looking at, can I possibly use magnetometers to kind of sense shifts in the magnetic field? and use that as a way to create sound. I'm quite interested in how I might be able to explore more the phenomena of what is actually happening with magnetic fields rather than using the movement of the light to kind of create sound. But I'm also kind of quite drawn to this idea of using the light because of the cryptochrome sensing in bird's eyes. So it's still kind of on its journey and its exploration. Yeah, I think I might also try a version with feedback where I've kind of got a microphone on the end and like an array of speakers and different speakers. So there's definitely some things that I'm going to like move on to explore and set up and try out. And also kind of changing my manual switching controller to something that I can automate and that may also use the information from where the pendulum is to sort of decide how it might switch. Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at the moment with that piece, and I've come to the end of my time as well, so I don't know if people have got any questions or thoughts or...
Okay, you mentioned, am I coming through the mic? Oh, okay. You mentioned that you do a bit of field recording.
Yeah.
But you don't necessarily always use the field recordings for the final work. So I'm just wondering kind of what what do you learn from field recording? And then how does that kind of find its way into the final work?
Okay, yeah. Well, actually, I've not really shown pieces in this presentation now, but I do quite a lot of site-specific work and site-responsive work. And so, for instance, in the Flow Country, I was there on a residency and I wanted to learn a lot about the ecosystem, about the nature restoration they're doing there. So a lot of my inspirations and starting points come from learning about or like being in a particular place or trying to sort of experience a different ecosystem or like understand what's happening. And I find that field recording in that context, especially listening on hydrophones or geophones to sounds we can't usually hear, just gives me this like deeper connection to that place and location and a way of being in it and thinking in it and kind of connecting to it. So often I'm really drawn to doing field recording for those reasons. It's kind of like a thinking space or a process space or a way of being within a certain place especially if I'm doing a residency there. And I did actually use some field recordings in this piece because they're recordings from electromagnetic fields, but I started to realise that I wasn't really using them in the piece, but they kind of informed my process. And that's when I started doing these listening walks where I'd have wireless headphones and I'd take people on a journey to follow a river and we'd listen together. And I find that an amazing experience actually, because often with field recording you're kind of off on your own, like listening and staying. And I do find that amazing as well, where you're kind of really still for long periods of time, like really focusing on listening. And I feel like it opens up my mind to different sort of ways of observing. But bringing people on walks where we do that together actually is really rewarding and amazing. And it kind of like, I don't know, it just teases out different sort of potential ways of interacting with each other and with the space and conversations that kind of come out of that.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. It's all very awesome. There's some interesting parallels, I think, between your tipping point piece and these pendulum pieces. But it kind of sounds like you're reversing the process. The first for tipping point, you made an installation and then turned it into an instrument. Is that right? And now you've made an instrument and you're turning it into an installation. How do you? I don't know. Was there a thought process behind? And it's kind of not much of a specific question, but I just think that's interesting.
Yeah, I think I kind of oscillate between the two ways of presenting work, and often I quite like creating something that can be both. And when I was making this piece, I didn't know if it was going to be a performance or an installation, but when I made the prototype of 3 pendulums and I was still playing with it, when I presented it, I presented all sorts of different aspects and outcomes from my residency. When I presented it, I presented it as a kind of performative thing, and then that kind of grew from there. But I think yeah, it's become something that is like has got a beginning and an end and a shape and a form. It's become a kind of composition, and I'm quite interested to work out how to create something that is maybe more stripped. If I want to make a really stripped down version, then I think having it as an installation where people can come in and out at any point and kind of experience it and make their own sort of journey and arc through it. Yeah, I want to kind of try and like work with it in that way as well.
Cool. Thank you.
Cool, yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I think some of the ideas that you drew on from when, back in the days when electricity was sort of almost a parlour trick, where, you know, people would take a bucket of salt water and build up static electricity and, you know, shocks people or do something fun with it. It's a really cool era compared to now when it's, you know, such a fundamental part of everything that we do. I don't know, how do you find ways to maybe bring back some of that whimsy of the, you know, back when it was like, oh, this is fun, but surely there's no practical use for this. You know, whereas now it's sort of, oh, well, we know this is all so useful, but how do we find these creative uses for it, maybe?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I think what I liked about those experiments was that people were doing them and discovering, but then it kind of massively informed loads of other things. And it's that kind of open-ended research that I think, you know, should be really celebrated and continued. And so I suppose the way that I approached the residency was to kind of really just follow all these different like sort of sparks of interest and things that I thought might lead to other things. So yeah, that kind of like cross-disciplinary research or kind of drawing inspirations from multiple histories or phenomena. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question properly, but yeah, I don't know.
Great, yeah.
Something playful about, hopefully maybe there's something playful about how this kind of operates or plays out or people experience it.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for this fantastic talk. I'm curious about the sort of difference between your physical making and the digital making that goes along with it, because I guess you have certain places, like with those Schmidt trigger oscillators or with the sort of skipping needles on turntables or whatever. There are real kind of low-level electrical or mechanical phenomena where you kind of have some notion of maybe what it's going to do, but there's also a lot of surprise and kind of unpredictability, and you can kind of live with that and work with that and develop it. And I see a lot of that. Then you go and make a max patch potentially, and I guess you're in a much more theorized space at this point where you kind of have to work with well-defined objects with sort of idealized behaviors. And do you find any way that you can kind of keep that element of surprise and openness to phenomena when you're working in that kind of environment, or do you inevitably feel sort of squeezed into particular ways of thinking at the point that you're working on the computer?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I actually work with a max patcher. I don't do my max patching. I know max to a certain level, but I work with someone who's really more experienced than me. So at that point, the knowledge that I have of max is really useful because I need to be able to communicate how I want something to work. Ultimately, I want to kind of like make that side of it myself, because I think I might be going a bit off question, I'll come back to it, but I think the process of making and getting things wrong and things like things taking time to physically make, the idea is sort of sitting within that process as well. So actually, my actual processes are much more the kind of hands-on building making, and I kind of like there is this conversation between something working or like doing the thing that you are aiming for it to do, and how that sounds and looks, and that constant sort of to and fro. Yeah, I don't think that's answering your question, I'm not sure. But just, yeah. Yeah, kind of like, I think with this piece, I find some frustrations with, like, when it's on the computer. But that might just be because I'm not the main max patcher and I can't do as many manipulations on the fly as I'd like to. I quite like things that take quite a bit of time to actually sort of craft and build. like when I made Tipping Point, I really had no clue how to work with stepper motors or how to create the kind of mechanical advantage in that arm so that it'd be safe, whilst balancing glasses of water over mains electricity. So there was all these sort of things going on where I was completely out of my comfort zone in how it worked. And it just took me like a really long time to sort of reach that conclusion. But I liked the way it took me a long time, and I had to keep building stuff out of wood and sort of balancing things and like measuring and weighing things and torque and gears. And even though there were loads of moments of frustration with how long that took, the process of it happening, it allowed me to be bubbling away with the sort of all the other aspects of the piece, like how it sounds, how it might play out in a space, and but like more in a sort of subconscious way. So I sort of feel like the physical making space, that happens for me more so than perhaps on the computer. But that might just be because I'm collaborating with a Max Patcher.
That was an incredible talk. Thank you. I was just wondering, because you mentioned that you were synthesizing in this piece here, and you said it was a 26 channel. Did you say 26?
22.
22 channel. And because previously you said that one of the things that you love so much is the fact that you kind of set something in motion. You're part of, the stone flicking through, the water, and then everything else happens around it. But with the 22 channel synthesis going on, were you controlling, was that more like a performance, like you were actually deciding what sounds were being played, and did you have an understanding of what you were going to hear as opposed to your other projects where you don't?
I had a certain understanding of what was going to happen, but actually the way the sound was spatialized was based on the pendulum swing. So basically I could pull it to the center of the coil and then flick it away, but I couldn't know which direction it's going to go in.
Okay.
Or how much energy that might be, or whether it's going to bounce back, or, so I'd set up a system where that would spatialize it in the direction on that plane. But I couldn't know which way it's going to go. I just know that I've set it up to, I've chosen a sound and I've set it up to move.
Okay.
So I kind of am still doing that, setting something in motion, but have sort of kind of made a framework for that to act in. And then I was then just deciding where to place it in height.
Okay.
Because I guess I'd never worked in, 8 channels in January was was enough, and then suddenly I was doing 22. So it was, so I decided to do it that way, where one plane I would allow the pendulums to decide, and then the other plane I was moving.
So was that charted? Did you have a sheet for that? Did you know where you wanted to do it, or was it completely improvisational?
This piece is still quite improvised as I go through it. I've sort of got ideas about how I want to move through different textures, but it's really quite improvised.
Amazing.
Hello. It's all really interesting stuff. And on the subject of parlour tricks, so the thing that kept springing to mind was this really odd thing called the animal telephone, where, sorry to the vegans, but you would phone dead animals and they would do this. And it was like this really weird thing about the voice and the phone and the telephone. And then I saw somebody do this piece, Skip Shirley, and I can't remember who the other person was, where they hooked themselves up to things that electrocuted them while they held instruments.
Oh yeah, I think I've seen that. They kind of
and then that made me think. So you showed that graph of the animals.
The static charge, yeah.
Yeah. You showed the graph of the animals, and thinking about all the stuff that Oram spoke about. Where do humans live on that graph? And also, what would it be like to sort of augment, like not just as for like a little day trip, but actually to sit in that world for quite a few weeks, where you kind of augment your skills, wear some funny glasses or whatever. And then if you sort of took it away, would you kind of have a trace of that? Would you start to know where it was all the electricity, all the magnetism?
Yeah, I love that, because it sort of like harks back to, because what is it like to have magnetic? Because I was thinking at the beginning, what is it like to have magnetic sense? Do we have a magnetic sense? Is sense of direction just this kind of way of talking about magnetic sense? And it's like really fascinating to think about what is it like to be a bee, and like literally it's kind of like you're moving through this soup of like charges. But the closest thing, well, maybe the closest thing is I got really, when I was doing Tipping Point, I always have these weird experiences where I'd always meet a dowser. So I got really interested in dowsing. And that's like the body responding to where water is, and then the sticks or whatever device you use is just an amplification of that. And the guy, one of the dowsers that I met, does courses where you kind of do a lot of ways of getting back in touch with that sense. And so I think what you're talking about is that, you know, similar kind of thing where it's like, what can we do to sort of like maybe reveal some of these, or heighten our awareness of those other kind of phenomena that, I think about bats quite a lot as well, and how it might be to, you know, echolocate. There's a blind guy in America called who echolocates, and this is quite a few years ago now, but basically he can kind of click and understand, like literally just ride his bike through the woods by clicking and listening to the reflections. And when those sort of like brain sensors that are more portable were available, he put one of those on, and it's actually his visual cortex that's being stimulated from the sound. So it's just like the brain's so plastic. So this idea of like heightening something and then taking it away. And I think sometimes with the listening walks, when you reveal hidden sounds or underwater sounds or like really kind of heightened ways of listening, when you remove that, I think it does have an effect on how you listen to the world around you. I think it affects me, and I've had other people say that after doing a listening walk where you've kind of been amplifying all these different things, afterwards you listen in a more heightened way. Have you got any ways of...
So some sort of sensory substitution, so that you could, for really like gently all the time, know where it was, know the sort of intensity of the and the direction of the geomagnetic field.
Yeah, that would be nice. We need to sort out the quantum radical pair entanglement. That would be a nice thing to do.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Kathy.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.